everyone, and welcome to the Friends of Columbia Gorge's webinar, Fungus Among Us. We are thrilled to bring back webinars just before Thanksgiving to focus on one of the best fall treats in the gorge, fungus. We have so much room in our heart for you all attending tonight, and we are going to have an amazing journey into the world of mycology, or the study of fungi, with two experts in the field. Again, I want to thank you for joining us tonight as we learn about one of the most delicious fall treats that can be found in the gorge. Not only are fungi an excellent meal, they also play an important part in our ecosystem that we will learn all about tonight. So hopefully we don't get into too much truffle as we celebrate not only the mushrooms we all know and love, but some of the other lesser known fungi that are all around us. My name is Kenzie Hammond and I am your host for tonight. I'm the Youth and Community Education Specialist for Friends of Columbia Gorge. Our presenters for the night are Dr. Beug and Krista Cushman. Our first speaker will be Dr. Beug, a local mycologist who has decades of knowledge in this exciting field of science. Michael's work has been published in many scientific journals, and he brings a wealth of knowledge into tonight's webinar. Our second speaker is Krista Cushman, a viticulturist and naturalist with a love of the Columbia Gorge and mushrooms. She's an expert foraging guide, leading many groups into the gorge to learn the art of foraging for mushrooms. Before I pass the virtual microphone to Michael, I wanted to talk a little bit about Friends if you are new to our events. Friends of the Columbia Gorge is the only conservation group entirely dedicated to protecting, preserving, and stewarding the gorge. Friends led the fight to protect the gorge by helping create the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area over 40 years ago. And it's been working ever since to safeguard the gorge and make sure the natural wonders found today will be preserved for future generations to come. Friends is entirely dedicated to protecting and enhancing the scenic, natural, cultural, and recreational resources in the gorge. Example of the intersection of conservation and people is in our land acknowledgement. Although most people call these land acknowledgements, they're really acknowledgements for the people who originally walked and cared for the lands, as well as their descendants who still do so today. In the Columbia Gorge, that means recognizing the 4 treaty tribes: the Warm Springs, the Yakima, the Umatilla, and the Nez Perce. Each of these tribes have treaty rights to the lands and waters of the gorge. In addition, there are the reestablished tribes of the Cowlitz and Grand Ronde and the unrecognized Chinook people. All of these tribes represent the original caretakers of the gorge, and their efforts today benefit all of us. Finally, please check out Friends of Columbia Gorge and Willamette Week's Give Guide, an annual effort to raise funds for and draw attention to the work of local nonprofits during November and December. Friends has $25,000 in matching gifts, which means that your gift goes twice as far when you donate to us. Upcoming giveaways that you'll be entered to win when you donate include a trip to Guatemala, a backpack full of goodies from Cotopaxi, and a shopping spree from New Seasons. You don't want to miss out on this giving season. We invite you to join our community of over 5,000 members focused on long-term protection of the gorge with a donation today at gorgefriends.org/GG. And now, Michael, please take it away.
Okay. This is an introduction to fungal ecology, which I've been asked to give. And originally, people were really afraid of mushrooms and referred to them entirely as toadstools. And we've grown up in this mushroom phobic society, but I want to introduce you to the true excitement that we can get from the fungi. First of all, the plant itself is microscopic and in the soil or on leaves. And the mycelium is the plant. And when bundles of mycelium get together, it's called rhizomorphs. The smallest little pieces in here are the individual threads of mycelium, and then big groups of them are visible to the naked eye. but the mycelium itself is typically about 10 to 15 microns in diameter, and it's very, very tiny. Now, there's the fungi are divided into two main groups. Most of the big things that we look at and think about and pay attention to are called basidiomycetes, and that is mushrooms that produce their spores on top of a club. And this is Panellus fonsecii, which is a common lawn mushroom showing a basidium on a scanning electron microscope with the 4 spores on top of it. But a vast number of mushrooms out there are really small, some of them only single cells like a yeast, and those are the ascomycetes. And that's what I want to talk about first. So ascomycetes are fungi that produce their spores in sacs. The bigger fungi that we pay attention to that are ascomycetes typically are the ones in this upper right-hand corner where the spores are lined up, typically 8 spores in the tube. And then when the spores are mature, they're either spit out the tube or a lid opens at the top of the tube and releases the spores. But in some of the ascomycetes, these stacks full of spores are held inside of a pear-shaped vessel called a parathecium. And that's the left-hand picture. And truffles are the center rear, where there's typically 4 spores inside of a sac, and the sacs are all inside of something that looks like a buried puffball. A lot of the fungi that cause plant diseases produce their spores in a thing called a cleistothecium. This is the middle bottom picture. And then on the far right is to realize that all mushrooms have both a sexual and an asexual stage. The asexual stage is almost invariably very, very small, and we don't see it. Now, in order for life to evolve on Earth, the very first thing that had to happen is fungi had to be blown out from the sea onto the land, and they wound up pairing with bacteria and forming lichens. And the lichens have a very interesting ability, because the way fungi feed, and fungi, by the way, are very, very close to animals. They're not at all closely related to plants. They feed by their stomachs are essentially external. They send chemicals out into the environment, and these chemicals are strong enough to be able to dissolve rock. And so over time, these lichens that form, these very first lichens, were able to dissolve enough rock to form a soil, and that plants started to evolve. So at the very beginning of life on land are the fungi paired to make the lichens. And this is a typical lichen, Letharia vulpina, known as wolf lichen, very, very common in the Columbia Gorge. Now, a lot of the ascomycetes will do things like they form apple scab. And the very first image, I was looking at peach leaf curl in a tree. And these are fungi that don't form a fruiting body at all. The spores are just produced free on the surface of the mushroom, of the plant. And in the case of Venturia inequalis, it produces the scab that you see on apples that are organically grown, as they are at my orchard. And then if you look, say, at grapes, you'll see a white dusting all over the grapes. And that's a coating of unicellular things called yeast. And very early on in the evolution of humans, you learned that when you crushed grapes and other things coated in yeast, the yeast would start fermenting the sugars and make wine. And it's overlaid on Penicillium notatum on bread. And from this particular fungus, if you get just exactly the right clone, it produces a lot of penicillin. And this became our really first important antibiotic discovered at the beginning of World War II. But Penicillium notatum can also have forms that produce very little penicillin. For example, it's used to infuse cheese and produce blue cheese. But there you're using the same fungus but a different strain that produces very little penicillin, but produces the delightful flavor of a blue cheese. And then other mushrooms are little tiny specialists that this one specializes in eating Oregon grape leaves. And the fungus itself are these little black hexagonal or multi-sided structures, and the spores are born in sacs inside of those structures. When they're mature, they open up and release the spores. So there's a lot of fascinating things. And there's also warfare going on. That's the little black lines where one fungal group is defending its territory against another. And trees can also put up defenses that'll show up as a black line or spalting in the wood to try and keep the fungus from invading the tree. And some fungi, ascomycetes, are very, very specialized. This one, Bisonectria cartilaginea, specializes in decomposing the dung of picas or picas that are found in the snowbanks. And a pica in the winter uses just one latrine. The whole community uses the same latrine. So if you pick this beautiful fungus up from its subiculum, that's that sort of whitish coating that these beautiful orange structures are growing on, you'll find the underside is just completely covered with pica droppings. And the other thing that you find is some of these ascomycetes are parasites. This is a parasite, Astrologomatus, that attacks corn. And actually it produces a very, very highly prized delicacy called huatlacuche. But the ascomycetes that we see and pay attention to commonly are things that form, like this is a tulip cup, and it can be 3 or 4 inches in diameter. And if you tap the side of a tulip cup, about 3 seconds later, there'll be a cloud of spores. And you can see right above the central tulip club, sort of a cloudy structure. That's millions and millions of spores that have just been released when those acini, those little sacs, bang against each other and simultaneously open and release spores in the quantity of millions to billions at a time. And some of the ascomycetes are really big and tempt people to eat. The Gyrometer esculenta group, however, has a toxin in it called gyrometrin that breaks down to monomethylhydrazine, which is well known as a liquid rocket fuel. A little bit causes no damage at all, but a moderate amount, then you get to a high amount, and suddenly you can die from ingesting this mushroom. And it's also highly carcinogenic. So when you get into the larger ascomycetes, like the members of the Gyrometer esculenta group, you really want to know how to identify them and tell them from the choice edibles. And of the choice edibles, Verpa bohemica is the earliest one that shows up in the spring. And Verpa bohemica specializes just in decomposing the litter under cottonwood trees. It's very, very highly specialized fungus. Some fungi decompose a wide range of things, others a very narrow range of things. So among the fungi, we have decomposers, but we also have fungi that form mycorrhizal relationships, i.e. partners with trees and plants. Now, sometimes the partnership turns more of a parasite when either the tree or the fungus dominates the partnership. So it can be a whole range of things. And here's something that forms a mycorrhizal species. This is Swillus cerulescens, and it's growing in association with the pine trees that are standing in this forest. And it can fruit in stupendous abundance. And that mycorrhizal association can exist in the ground for a very, very long period of time. And the other thing you find out, this is Marasmius aureates, which is a saprophyte. It's another basidiomycete, and it tends to grow in a fairy ring. And each year, the fairy ring is a little bit bigger because the fungus is breaking down the nutrients And inside, it can't move back inside because it's already eaten everything on the inside. So each year it gets a little bigger in diameter. And there's a fairy ring in Britain at Stonehenge that they can tell from the diameter and the rate of growth that must be at least 1,000 years old. That one plant has lived that long in the ground. So what we see and are interested in picking, and Marasmius aureates is a good edible, are the fruit of the plant, but the plant itself is in the ground. The organism is in the ground. And we're just, when we pick a fungus to eat or to study or to make medicine, we're just picking the fruit. Now, other mushrooms are very, very specialized in habitat, and out in the west, in the Rockies and whole western United States, we have a whole group of mushrooms that just grow associated with snowbanks in the spring. They tend to grow at high altitude where the summers get hot and dry very fast, and so they take advantage of that spring snow melt to do their fruiting quickly. So you have highly specialized things that are both seasonal and also habitual. Now, the very largest mushroom of all in terms of the fruit body is a Brygioporus nobilissimus. And this thing here is probably 400 or 500 years old, the fruit body itself. And it grows only on noble firs. And it's a very, very rare fungus. I have looked and looked for these for 55 years. I've never seen one. But yet, if you do the DNA, the Brygioporus nobilissimus as hypha and as DNA is present in a wide range of tree species all over the forest. It's actually one of the most common mushrooms out there, but it's just something that almost never fruits, and it only fruits in association with noble fir. And it has to be an old growth noble fir to produce one of these. And here's a mushroom that only grows is an annual. And Pseudoinonotus striatus is probably the largest annual mushroom. It only grows on oaks. It's very common, well, not common, but I find it in the Columbia River Gorge. And this thing was 3 feet in diameter. And the spores are white, and you can see the spores underneath the mushroom where they have fallen and cover the ground. And one of the important things for identifying all mushrooms is to be able to figure out the spore color. And sometimes you have to take a spore print, but often you get what I call is a free spore print in the woods. So we had first a very huge perennial polypore, and now this polypore that is a very large annual. And Armillaria ostiae, the honey mushroom, is actually the world's largest organism. The plant itself, the one existing in the Ochako Mountains, is the size of the Ochako National Forest and the age of the forest. Not the age of the trees in the forest, the ones that are currently living, but it's been there and existed as long as the forest has been there. The second largest Armillaria ostiae, which is the second largest organism in the world, is in Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. And the third largest is again this same species, and it's back in Michigan. So in this case, the plant is huge, but the fruit is not particularly big. The fruit is edible and tasty. It's another white spored mushroom, as you can tell from this dusting of spores all over the top. And this polypore is probably the most sought after of all of the polypores, Termetes versicolor, turkey tails, because it's prized for its ability to kill cancer cells. Now, it actually turns out that it works best if you grow it in culture because, well, for 2 reasons. One, just like Penicillium notatum, some collection of Termetes versicolor have a lot of cancer killing organisms in them, but other collections are very weak. So if you take a whole bunch of clones and you grow them up, and you find the clones that are very powerful at killing cancer cells, and then you produce those on mycelium, you have a potentially very important anti-cancer drug. And I actually see these as one of the keys to the goal of reducing cancer deaths by over 50%. A very, very powerful, very interesting mushroom that I've been studying now for about 15 years for its potential to inhibit and indeed kill many cancer cells. Now, among my very favorite edibles are the Hericium species, Hericium erinaceus on the right, lion's mane. Notice the big, long teeth, as you would see in the mane of a lion, and Hericium bear's head, Hericium abeatus, bear's head, with its much shorter teeth, much like the much shorter hairs on a bear's head. These two mushrooms are both incredibly delicious edibles. These are both in my top 5. Well, they're probably my top 1 and top 2 edible mushrooms of all. But if you culture these and you test it against nerve cells, you find that both of these produce chemicals that really increase the rate of neuron regeneration and neuron generation. And I think these will present some great potential for dealing with Alzheimer's disease and things like Lou Gehrig's disease and other neuron disease. So there are some really good edible mushrooms out there, incredible things like Hericium abeatus, by the way, can reach the size of a bushel basket. And I've picked a lion's mane that weighed 15 pounds. So these are exciting edibles as well as mushrooms with incredible potential for health and healing. And Lentinulla edotis shiitake is an Asian mushroom that does not grow wild in North America, but it's easily cultivated. And I call it a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde mushroom, because one of the things that this mushroom produces is lentinan. And lentinan has been used for years in Japan as an anti-cancer drug. The problem is that 4% of the people who eat this mushroom raw or are treated with lentinan wind up with a case of shiitake flagellate dermatitis, because lentinan causes the rupture of the microcapsularies in your on the surface of your skin, and this dermatitis will last for a couple of weeks and is incredibly painful. But if you thoroughly cook the shiitake, the lentinan is destroyed. And indeed, all mushrooms should be thoroughly cooked before eating them. And this is a critical thing to realize. And I'm interested in shiitake itself because, in addition to the lentinan, it has a wide range of chemicals in it that will reduce inflammation and are good for pain killing and are potentially useful in helping to slow things like skin cancer. So here is an incredible edible mushroom. And by the way, if you make a tea from it, the tea is delicious and is a good medicinal. And then you can still eat the mushroom, which is, again, in my top 5 favorite edible mushrooms. And here is the mushroom is growing on a log, Lentinulla edotis. And finally, I want to talk very briefly about mushrooms that change your mind, Psilocybe cyanescens. And I think these magic mushrooms, Psilocybe cubensis in particular, but also cyanescens, have tremendous ability to cure PTSD, to deal with anxiety, to deal with anger, to make people feel more loving and caring towards one another. So this is a very different kind of medicinal mushroom, but a very, very important one. And that's my story about mushrooms and why I love them so much. And now I'm going to turn it over to Krista, and it's her turn.
Well, hi, everybody. My name is Krista Cushman. Michael, thank you so much for that wonderful talk. I always learn so much from you. I really appreciate it. So thank you. All right, let's get to it. I'm going to share my content. All right. Are we good? Do we have it? All right, good. Thank you. All right, we're just going to start to get us in the mushroom mindset by looking at this video I took last weekend in the Columbia Gorge, just right on Larch Mountain. So beautiful, foggy, misty fall weather, beautiful day. My talk is going to be a little bit different. We're going to focus on common fall and winter mushrooms of the Columbia Gorge. It's going to be mushrooms that you can walk outside your door, maybe in your neighborhood, or go on a hike in the forest and be able to identify and start noticing a few mushrooms around you. We live in such a precious place, and I really want you tonight, my talk, to help deepen your relationship with the place that we live by just starting to notice these little details about these amazing organisms. All right, let's get started. So the first one that I want to talk about is called Russula brevipees. And this is ectomycorrhizal mushroom, like all russulas. So Michael was discussing what that means a little bit. It's just that they have this relationship with plants, and these form a hyphal sheath around the roots of its buddy plant. They don't penetrate their host cell walls. They can be mycorrhizal with oaks, conifers, pines, Douglas fir. They're not that picky. I tend to find them in older forests. The cap starts out rounded with kind of a central depression, and you see at this point, it's very vase-like. If you look at this mushroom, you can see that these have something called gills. This is probably the type of spore-bearing surface that we're most familiar with. They have long, they're like pages in a book, knife blades. You could remove one without destroying the whole body of the fungus. These mushrooms, when you're walking through, if you're taking a hike, the caps are often completely invisible under a layer of duff or soil and pine needles. They make a little bulge or something called a shrump, a mushroom bump under the soil. So as you remove it, you'll see these huge mushrooms come out, really beautiful. A fun feature to notice is that a few of these, if you look at them, have a blue tint to the gills, or right where the stipe meets the gills, there's a little tiny bluish green line just on some. So it's something to look really closely at. These are edible, but they're not a great edible in my professional opinion. The next one that we'll talk about is an ascomycete, which Michael, thank you so much for discussing. So I don't have to get into, but if you were to look at this under a microscope, you would find little tiny cut fungi with little spore launchers inside of them. Each one of those little orange colors is like its own little dot of spore launcher. It's really beautiful under a microscope. This Hypomyces lactiflorum is one of the parasitic ascos that Michael was talking about. So this Hypomyces actually attacks and infects the Russula brevipees, this like kind of throwaway edible that's not so great, and turns it into this delicious lobster mushroom. So you see where the Russula brevipees had these long blade-like gills, you don't see any of those gills anymore. There was a study out of Quebec recently that an infected lobster mushroom doesn't have a lot of DNA anymore of the Russula brevipees. It mainly just shows the host, the Hypomyces lactiflorum. It's really interesting because russulas will glow under UV light, and this Hypomyces does not. So if you can see some partially parasitized mushrooms, some will glow and some will not. Pretty cool. It has really good texture. It doesn't have a lot of flavor, but it takes on flavors really well. Here's a little video of both that I took really just last week. So there's a brevipees and there's a lobster. If you find a brevipees, which are easy to find because they're big and white and huge, Look around for some lobster mushrooms. They're often found under the duff. Beautiful. All right, so another one that I'll quickly go into is Russula paulina. And this is one that I found just on a trail in the Columbia Gorge on a run last week. I was running by and it was so big and beautiful that I couldn't pass it by. One thing I think is really interesting, this is in the same genus as the Russula brevipies. That was the first mushroom we looked at. These have gills as well. A cool thing about this is that to identify this mushroom, color doesn't really matter. As people, we always want to look at color kind of first, like, oh, it's red, it's a shrimp Russula. But that doesn't really matter. We need to look at this checklist to make sure that we can identify the mushroom. So you see here the rosy stipe at the base. You see those really yellowy, creamy gills. It has an off-white to yellow spore print. It smells like shrimp. If you tried to peel away that color, it would only peel about halfway to the center. And you can see that I scraped the stipe a bit with my nail. It bruises yellow or brown. If it doesn't bruise yellow or brown, it's not a shrimp. The stipe is really firm and it has like pithy stuff in it. So I just found this on my run a few days ago. It's right here, right now, and it's delicious. I've heard they're really good on pizza. It lives with both hardwoods and conifers where we live, and it's also mycorrhizal like all Russulas. I just had to include this mushroom, Clitosidiodora, because it's so beautiful. You can go through this kind of brown, quiet, decaying forest of the winter, and all of a sudden come across these blue caps that seem to come out everywhere, all around you. And another lesson that this mushroom teaches us is to smell your mushrooms. Always smell your mushrooms. This, when you pick it up, it doesn't smell like the mushroom of your grocery store. It smells like anise or fennel. And when you cook it, it can taste like black licorice almost. So really good on a salad. These a cool thing about these, you see that I broke off this stipe on the left part, or my daughter did with her purple mitten hand. But if you can excavate the entire mushroom, including the base of the stipe, you'll see that there's these fibrils of mycelium at the base. It decomposes leaf litter, so the time is now as those leaves are falling to the ground. And when I pick these, I found these at Post Canyon last year, and I just put them on if I'm picking a very delicate mushroom like this, I might put it on a little blanket inside of my basket, because they really will just fall apart if you put them in your basket. Anyway, really delicious. Look for them in those microclimates that might be holding on to a little bit of moisture by a log. Okay, here's a little video. Okay, this is Zalaria, and it is such a beautiful mushroom, and it's one that is just growing in. It's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's one of those that you could go your whole life without noticing, but once you see it, you'll see it everywhere. I took this photo just a few days ago on that same trip to Larch Mountain. So beautiful, next to this little hypholoma. I felt like it looked like little hands coming up. This is actually a bioluminescent, you heard that right, a bioluminescent fungus. It is it's saprotrophic, which means it decomposes stuff for its food. The white part is asexual spores, and later on in its development, it has those reproductive spores that come out that you saw me spreading throughout the forest. They grow mainly on hardwoods, but mainly on conifers. Beautiful mushroom to notice, teeny tiny, and they don't always have these little antlers at the tip. Sometimes they're just kind of a club, but these were just incredible ones that we saw. I'm gonna skip this one because Michael did such a good job, but I will just say one thing to think about is we have one kind, the bear's head, that he said will grow on conifers. Everything else will grow on hardwoods. They're just so beautiful. And as they age, the teeth will grow longer and longer and longer. Okay, this is more of a good to know mushroom. This is called Lactarius. This is a genus, and we're going to use this as a jumping point for a really fun mushroom that we're going to talk about next. So as I'm talking, I will start my video, but you can see that this is over here, it's called Lactarius because it lactates. To the left, you can see that thick, milky substance lactating out of that mushroom. You can see in real time in the video right now, those globs of that thick, almost, it looks like coconut milk, whole milk lactate coming out of those gills. So beautiful. To identify Lactarius down to species, sometimes you need a microscope. Sometimes it's not possible because we don't have a good species description yet, but you'll need to notice the color of the milk. They can be yellow or red, or to the right is one of my favorite mushrooms to find. You can see that the milk stays white, but the flesh stains purple. I scream with glee whenever I see these. These are the most beautiful. The purple, it's hard to capture in a photo, but it looks like a gem or an amethyst. It's just really stunning. A beautiful mushroom to see. So in addition to these Lactarius, let's move forward. And a species that we'll talk about is Lactarius rubidus. These are called the candy cap mushroom. Some of you might have heard of like dessert mushrooms. This is the height of all of that. If you noticed in the last slide, the caps were very smooth and kind of slimy. The mushroom word for that is viscid. If you notice these Lactarius rubidus really closely, you can see that it's bumpy. So if you were to touch it, it stays dry even when it's wet. That's kind of what it feels like. Very like an orange peel texture. Also on the left side, you can see that it's exuding this milk, but it doesn't look like that thick tinned coconut milk or whole milk of the last species of Lactarius we looked at. This one looks much more like skim milk. So these are both like identifying characteristics for this rubidus. This was such a fun one to find. I have a hat that on a hike I was walking and I found so many and I didn't have any place to put them, so I stuck them in my hat. And 5 years later, my hat still smells like maple syrup. These are such a joy to find. They're mycorrhizal. They live with a lot of oaks, and I'm pretty sure I found them with maples and Douglas fir. Really beautiful. One thing to note is that they don't smell like maple syrup when they're fresh, but as you slowly dry them over time, you should not dry them really quickly, but if you slowly dry them, maybe with a fan in a room, that maple syrup smell will just hit you. Really amazing. I love these mushrooms. Okay, here is a Pseudohydnum gelatinosum. That is a mouthful. What a lovely mushroom. These are fascinating for me. The other day I was with a friend and I forgot the Latin name of this mushroom because we call it a cat's tongue. I usually use Latin names, but for some reason, this one, cat's tongue, feels so right. When my friend told me about the Pseudohydnum, I paused and I just was thinking, like, why is it a Pseudohydnum? And tell me more about that. And in my research, I discovered that this is, once again, an example of convergent evolution in the fungal realm. So these little teeth that you saw on this jelly fungus, I'll run the video again. Oops, no, I won't. We'll go back. Come back to me. There. Okay. So if you can see these tiny little teeth, this is an example of convergent evolution. So these are totally unrelated to the hericium that Michael discussed earlier. It's just like this evolution figured out this really efficient trait that it passed on to increase this surface area for more spores on its spore-bearing surface. So it's very dissimilar from most things with teeth, but it still has teeth. Mushrooms are so smart, so interesting. So these will grow on wood or woody debris, often causing white rot. These are edible. So interesting. You can make jelly out of them. And I've even heard people using candy caps to flavor a Pseudohydnum or a cat's tongue. All right. I saw that Tim asked a question about how do you know the difference between like a white chanterelle or a golden chanterelle. And I want you to notice that I put Cantharellus here. I didn't put a specific species. That's the genus. Why didn't I put a specific species? Well, we have lots. And in this picture, we have Sebelvedis, the white chanterelle, and we also have Formosus, the golden chanterelle. But we have more. There's some almost like hybridized kinds of Cascadensis and Roseocanthus. So there's lots of ones. These are ones that grow in the Pacific Northwest. They do not grow, Tim's question was about the Olympics, and those are the same ones that grow here, but they would be different than the species that grow in the Midwest. How can you tell the difference between them? Well, a lot of the identification factors are the same. You don't really need to go to species unless that's something that interests you. It interests me, but if it doesn't interest you, you can still, if you understand how to identify a chanterelle, it doesn't matter what species you have. You can use them the same ways. So if you peel them, they can peel like string cheese. They have these false gills that twist and fork and melt onto the flesh of the mushroom. So unlike those blade-like knife-like gills of the russulas and the Clitosobi that we saw earlier, these twist and fork and fold into each other. It's also really firm. You can see as I cut into these chanterelles right here, they are not hollow. Chanterelles in the Pacific Northwest also do not get buggy. And I mention that specifically because in the Midwest, they do. Here, there's also a lookalike if you're just beginning, and it's hollow and does get maggots. So if you think you have a chanterelle and there's a maggot inside of it, you did not find a maggot. So, or you did find a maggot, but you did not find the chanterelle. These are really slow growers. They can be up for 45 days. Different species will live with different trees. But if you just look for spruce, Doug fir, hemlock, these white chanterelles don't seem to play nice with other types of fungi. They really like to, when I find them and big patches of them, I tend to find only them. So they like kind of sandy acidic soil where things like beargrass and low growing Oregon great bar. But if you find a big cache of chanterelles, you get that hit of dopamine and you just want to harvest all of them. I want to caution you at that point to just take a breath and notice everything around you. Notice the smells and notice the sights. Notice what plants you see living, flowering, dying. And this is the habitat that we're talking about. This is that mushroom sense that people have. It's pattern recognition of finding this whole cacophony of the habitat of these mushrooms. And I'm still learning. Every single time I go out, I feel like my picture gets deeper. And that's really about this relationship that foraging can get you. Over here, we have something called like a yellowfoot or a winter chanterelle. These are mycorrhizal. They like really well-decayed soil. They have a white spore print. They're yellow-brown. I also didn't put species on here because there's a few different kinds. But these are edible, delicious. You can see that they have decurrent gills, which means they kind of go down the stipe, just like those chanterelles do. They also have false gills that twist and fork into each other. And you can eat them. They're delicious. Over here is another ascomycete, like Michael was talking about. This is a Helvella vespertina. And oh my gosh, these are having a banner year this year. They are coming out in force. I went on a run at the Twin Tunnels Trail a few days ago, and I had to stop and take this photo, much to the annoyance of the person running with me. But that's what we get when we go running with me. But so we took this photo. There was a ton all over the place, so beautiful. These are a very common species in the fall and winter, but they can be hard to see. It's one of those that you can go your whole life without seeing, and then all of a sudden, they're everywhere. Once you open your eyes to mushrooms, you can see so much. These grow with conifers in the fall, and these are edible if they are well cooked. People often parboil them first before cooking them. People also call these like elven saddles or black saddle mushrooms. So they have these deep black caps and these firm, dry, rubbery stipes. They're really, really beautiful. If you're going to eat them, look out for a pink mold that can attack them, that can make you sick. Over here, this is a big group of mushrooms called earth stars. And I chose this one because in your neighborhood, as you're taking walks, you might be able to find these right away. These are all over the place, and I find them even into April. So they're everywhere. And if I remember, yeah, yes, great, okay, sorry. Oops, we're gonna go back. All right. Yes. Perfect. Okay, so you can see that they release their spores. They're like puffballs with really thick skins, but the outer layer opens and peels back, and they form star-like rays. And there's my daughter kind of smushing it. We're being a little gentle and a little not gentle, but they're really beautiful. And just all around Hood River, where I live, when I'm walking, I see them in abundance. A really special mushroom. So here's another one. If we just learned about the pseudohydnum, you know that I paused because this is a hydnum. This is also called a hedgehog mushroom. And you'll notice again that I didn't put a species there. These are all different species of these hedgehog mushrooms. These have teeth and they're really adorable. You can see that before I took the picture, I pet most of these and I crushed some of those spines. So you can go on a little hunt to see where I was touching those spines. So cute. But if they look a lot like chanterelles from the top, and their DNA is very similar. So if you turn it over, they're both choice edibles. These I actually like more than chanterelles. They're a little bit sweeter, a little bit crisper, and texturally I enjoy them a lot more. These were named actually before chanterelles. So the family is named after these hedgehogs instead of chanterelles. So cute. Some of these species can only be identified by a microscope or DNA. So saying it's a hydnum is a pretty good bet, but there's a few that you can get if you're really going to key it out. Michael discussed this, but I wanted these honey mushrooms, but I wanted to just talk about a few different spots here, a few other things. On the left side, you can see in that photo that there's those white spores. So to identify mushrooms down to species, we need spore prints often. So we don't need to take a spore print. We don't need to cut off the stipe and put it on a piece of paper, because honey mushrooms grow with these overlaying caps. They dropped the spores on the cap. It's something to notice in mushrooms that overlap and grow like this. You often don't have to take a spore print. Really, really obvious with these honey mushrooms. And I noticed in Michael's photo too, it was just in abundance. Another thing to know about these is that you can eat the caps, but a lot of people come away with an upset stomach. And some people don't. And this is going to lead me to talk about edibility in mushrooms. When people are first learning how to mushroom hunt, I think the first lesson and the first question that they'll always ask is it poisonous? Is it edible? Is the question that I get the most. And I want to kind of talk about that question really quickly. Edibility is a really complex topic, and we hold mushrooms to higher standards of edibility than we do plants or animals. What I mean by this is when you eat a plant, you know how to prepare it, what parts to eat. You don't eat raw kidney beans or green potatoes. You know how to cook those, when it would be good or bad. You know those individual things. In the same way you don't eat raw chicken, you can eat raw tuna. I think of it a little bit about the logical fallacies of thinking about edibility in mushrooms. People think that there's if it stains blue, it'll kill you. If it's a white mushroom, it will kill you. There's no hard and fast rule. What it sounds like is, like, for example, if we took rhubarb, how you can eat the stem of a rhubarb, but not the leaves, and you don't eat the roots. If we apply that to kale, we would think that the kale's leaves are poisonous and the stem is edible and we can't eat the roots. Or if we applied it to a carrot, we wouldn't eat the leaves, we would eat the stem, but not the root. So there's these logical fallacies as people try to apply what they know about one mushroom to another mushroom. But the way that you determine edibility in anything is by knowing what you're eating, that one specific mushroom, knowing how to prepare it, and then preparing it in that way. So we're going to kind of think about mushrooms in the same way that we think about plants or animals. And another thing to know is that we can't touch all plants. Like there's poison oak or hemlock can give us rashes, and in the Apiaceae family can give us with sunlight. But these mushrooms, you can touch any mushroom. You can touch the most deadly mushroom and it doesn't hurt you. Something to consider with this mycophobia that Michael was talking about. Okay, the last one I'm going to talk about is this tricholoma, and this is a masutake. Such a beauty. These are having an amazing year, and it's a great year to learn how to hunt them. It's a great year to learn how to hunt them. You can hear my daughters. This was a few weeks ago. They found some masutakes that looked like a butt. So you can see kind of, it wasn't the first butt mushroom that we had found that day. So lots of fun things. These, they're really, really delicious. You can see that the stipe is tapered and it has a dusty part at the base of it. It is... it has a partial veil. Do you see that white in the middle? It's just starting to break to show the gills underneath. A partial veil protects the gills from damage before they're mature. You can find these really even after freezing. So now is a great time to look. So the gills are really crowded, attached to the stipe, sometimes by a notch, so they do not run down it. Another thing is they're really hard. If you squeeze them really hard, they're not going to fall apart. You also see that that base has that sandy kind of texture at the bottom. Also, it has that reddish brown coloring on the stipe and on the cap. If you could feel it, it is velvety but firm at the same time. It's a real amazing thing for your senses. One of my favorite mushrooms to hunt just because, yeah, it's amazing. The smell is the most important factor though in this. It's like spicy and smells like cinnamon, nothing like you would expect a mushroom to smell like. Some people say it smells like dirty socks and cinnamon, and its flavor is really well, unlike most mushrooms that release its flavor compounds through fat, these are really delicious with water. So you can cook them with rice or cook them in soup, and they're especially delicious. Banner year for these guys. My kind of end of my presentation is just a call to you. I know a lot of people love to identify mushrooms and plants and flora and fauna and everything through and fungi through an app. I'm going to encourage you to use iNaturalist. It's a wonderful community of naturalists, and this community science movement is a really exciting place to be with a lot of energy. Highly recommended, like come join us. And thank you so much. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Kenzie. Let's see if we can get back to Zoom to do it. Thanks, Kenzie.
Those were some great presentations. Thank you both so much for those, for your insight and knowledge. If you haven't already yet, put your questions for Michael and Krista in the Q&A box. We have gotten quite a few questions. So Krista and Michael, we're going to make this a little bit of a speed round for answering questions. So you guys can turn your cameras and microphones on, and we'll go through the questions together. All right, so your first question for both of you is, how does elevation impact what mushrooms you can find at different times of year?
Well, it makes a dramatic difference. Basically, I start along the Columbia River in February, and then as the season progresses, I follow certain plants higher and higher, like the Verpa bohemica, one of the earliest things to fruit, shows up when the leaves on the cottonwood trees are the mouse ear size. That means along the Columbia in February. Up in the mountains, it can mean June. So you have to watch your seasons and your elevations, and then you also have to know when your mushrooms like to fruit. There are some mushrooms that only fruit in the spring, others in the fall, others have a wide season.
Thank
I
you.
want to just add to that really quickly. It's traveling back or forward in time. And that's why when we find a mushroom that we want to find again, we pause, because what's happening at that elevation will then be transferred to another elevation as you move up. So during morel season, there might be a certain flower that's blooming or a butterfly that you see. We're always adding those pictures. Maybe if you're looking for porcini, those fur tips are a certain length. Every single time you know when to stop, because you're noticing all of these things.
Right, thank you. The next question, are fungi generally closer related to the animal kingdom than the plant kingdom?
They're not at all related to the plant kingdom. They evolved late in the animal kingdom realm on that branch of the tree. So they're like us, not at all like plants. Except we digest our food inside, they digest their food outside.
Thank you. Do honey mushrooms indicate a host tree is dying? If so, how can a forest sustain such a large growth of honey mushrooms?
They're not all that parasitic. In other words, they'll only kill a weak tree. They won't kill a strong, healthy tree.
I want to remind everyone too that what Michael said about that big polypore. So there can be fungi present that we never see, that never fruit. They can be in all of the trees, but they'll only present themselves under certain conditions.
Thank you. Do we have truffles in the gorge?
Yes.
All right. How does Phypholoma parasite get under the ground to attack the former Rusula, and when does it attack at Rusula?
It's a hypomyces, not a hypholoma, and it attacks in the ground. Once the mushroom has come up, it never gets attacked. The attack is always before emergence, and it'll come up. The first set of spores are white, and it originally comes up white, but the gills are already gone, and then it turns orange, and then it goes to the third type of spores where it's sort of purple brown and is no longer good to eat, but it's a good dye fungus. So the artists become interested.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll just add on to that to make it super clear. It happens at a mycelial level, and spores are around us all the time, and they can, how do they get underground? When are they not underground is kind of the thing. I think one thing is people think that if they find a Russula brevipes and they put a hypomyces, like a lobster next to it, it'll slowly change. But like Michael said, it happens before they come up.
Now, there are other hypomyces that attack the mushroom once it's up, but the lobster always attacks before.
Delicious. We're very lucky.
How did you both become interested in mycology, and what inspired you to pursue a career in the field?
I love Michael's story.
Somebody brought me a bag of morels when I was a poor graduate student and had only been a toadstool kicker. In fact, never even saw mushrooms. But morels, I thought, tasted like a New York steak when properly cooked. And by the way, all mushrooms should be properly cooked. And it's rare that you destroy any cancer killing organisms. You're much more likely on cooking things to destroy things that will give you cancer. And so it's critical to cook all mushrooms thoroughly. The only objection being truffles, which are consumed in small amounts, tiny amounts.
I got into mushrooms because I love plants, and I was in a forest that I knew really well. And then one day in October, I was always walking in there. And then one day I didn't recognize it. Everything had just exploded, and I was really captivated. And there's such a vocabulary for mushrooms that I had a lot of wonderful friends that helped me learn the basics so I could kind of take it from there. But it's just endlessly interesting. It's endlessly interesting, but it's just one of those things where you don't see them. And then people talk about an awakening. And I had one too. I'm no different. I had an awakening.
Thank you. Where do lion's mane grow, and can they be found in the gorge?
Yeah, they grow on oaks.
And maples.
Right.
On
And
oaks. On oaks, any oak, any oak. I had an oak tree in my yard that had a lion's mane in it. Yeah, they can be anywhere. Also, you can cultivate them, like the Columbia Mushroom Company sells kits because they're saprotrophic. Which means they decay. They don't live with a plant host, so you can try growing some too. But yeah, just look on oaks. When you're around oaks, check them out.
Can elfin saddle only be white?
What was the question?
Can elfin saddle mushrooms only be white?
They're rarely white. There are some white ones. They're almost always gray to black. But they can be, some of them can be there's Helvella crispa and Helvella lactea are the two white ones. Vespertina is gray to black.
And another thing that I'll add to that is that it's a common name and not a Latin name. And so it can mean different things. Somebody might use it in a different way.
With that said, what safety precautions do you both take when foraging for mushrooms, and how do you teach this to people?
I teach people how to see mushrooms, how to see mushroom caps and spore-bearing surfaces and all of those little details. I'm plugging Michael's book here. You can see I haven't even had it that long, and this is what it looks like. It really does take you, though, through how to look at mushrooms and how to see them through a key, which is you make a choice and you go one way or the other. So like if it has teeth, you might go to one page, or gills to another. So you just have to know that mushroom. That's the safety precaution. As far as that, I have a GPS phone. I have extra water and snacks. I have a way. Yeah, I have a satellite phone. I have I have maps, offline maps. I have online maps. I have whistles. I have shelter. I have all of those things. Those are my safety precautions, and I always go. I always tell somebody where I'm going, the general vicinity, as far as that.
I agree.
All right, how does climate change and habitat loss impact fungal diversity and distribution?
Me and Michael know a lot about this. I think there's boom years, and there was a few years ago where we just couldn't find a mushroom. I mean, if that's what we're talking, climate is a big thing. So it's hard to find those little parts. Maybe Michael can speak because he's been foraging and looking at mushrooms for longer. But there are some very dry springs. What would you say, Michael?
Actually, it's the rainfall period over years that makes a difference. People think the rainfall in any one year is going to
Makes
bring
a big
mushrooms.
difference.
But the plants have to be healthy. They have to be growing well. They have to be producing sugars. And then the mushrooms will be using those sugars to grow their mycelium and set primordia, the little baby mushrooms that will produce what we're looking for to eat. No sugar, no mushroom, no fungi to harvest.
Thank you. Krista, you mentioned that some species of mushrooms aren't picky and can partner with multiple different species of trees, and then also mentioned that some are parasites. Why are some symbiotic in certain instances and some aren't? Is this a response to environmental stress and disturbance?
I'm sorry, would you repeat the question?
Yeah, you mentioned that some species aren't picky and can partner with multiple different species of
Oh,
trees,
yeah.
and that others are parasites. Why are some symbiotic in certain instances and some aren't? And is this a response to environmental stress and disturbance?
Oh, this is interesting. So, I mean, certain types of mushrooms just have different jobs. So some we talked about, when I say that they're saprotrophic, we're talking about that decaying. That's a whole different type of mushroom. So mushrooms can kind of move between, but they can't be mycorrhizal and then move to being saprotrophic. And then they can also be parasites. So that's something different. There's also mushrooms that can be saprotrophic, but if there's like low nitrogen in the soil, they can like hunt nematodes, like like the shaggy mane. So some can change. Morels seem to be able to have different jobs based on the type where they're growing, what they need, but those are very unrelated. Michael, would you add something to that?
Yep. Well, for example, mycorrhizal species, a tree, when it's not getting enough nitrogen, will pair up with the fungus or not getting enough water and will form a strong mycorrhizal relationship. But later in the year, when the conditions are just right, it'll dump that fungus and get rid of it, and sometimes even form a partner with a different fungus. So a lot of people think of these mycorrhizal situations as being stable, but they're kind of like human relationships. Some of them are long lasting and others break up and split constantly. And the same is true in the fungal world. They're looking for advantage, and sometimes a thing will be more parasitic, but if it needs something and it's killing off its host, it'll back off. So the tree is trying to win, the mushroom's trying to win, and these aren't just innocent battles, they're warfare out there.
All right, does rainy and cooler weather cause fungi to produce fruit?
Depends on the fungus.
Everybody is so different. Every single one wants a different thing. So some won't fruit until it gets cold. Some want, it's not until it gets really dry in the spring and it's crunchy and you're walking, and that's when you're going to find those mushrooms. It's one of those like logical fallacies that we can apply to like all mushrooms. You really have to know the one mushroom, just like plants like different types of habitats. Mushrooms are the same.
Is there a mushroom that grows on the Sitka spruce?
Well, you mean as a parasite or grows in association with? For example, if I want to find Cantharellus roseocanis, the rainbow chanterelle, I look for Sitka spruce. If I want to find King Boletes, I look for Sitka spruce. But there are other things that are epiphytes that are growing on the spruce, and we don't even know it. And Krista referred to those kinds of things. And then in the ground, there's all kinds of things interacting. I took 80 soil plots, half from a ponderosa pine forest and half from oak forest a number of years ago, to try and study Cortinarias. And we found literally hundreds of thousands of species. They had to throw the whole thing out. It was too complicated to understand. There are so many mushrooms out there and so many fungi doing so many different things. There was no easy answer.
Are either of you familiar with Bridgetown mushrooms? One of our viewers had a lion's mane kit, and it was a pretty fun experiment to use. And they wanted to know if there's any other mushroom kit businesses you all would suggest.
Neil, just like locally, I live in Hood River, and Neil has the Columbia Mushroom Company. He has some cool stuff, but I haven't tried a lot. Any you would recommend, Michael?
I didn't get the first part of the question.
What's a good mushroom growing kit?
Oh, there's tons of them out there.
There's a lot. Yeah.
And I generally, though, I buy my mushrooms already grown because the kits are a lot of fun, but it's an expensive way to do it. Unless you're literally creating the kits yourself. And then it's worth it.
Are Matsutakis associated with any particular mycoheterotroph?
Yes, Allotropa virgatum, the candy cane plant.
There was
And
a
it
picture
literally
in
looks
my
like a candy
slides.
cane in the summertime. And so when you see these little candy canes growing in the summer, you come back there during mushroom season in the fall when it's cool in the rains, and that's when Matsutake fruits. And that mycoheterotroph is a parasite on the Matsutake mycelium. So it will not grow if there's not Matsutake present.
Yeah, there was one in the center photo that you might have seen on my slides. The one with the kind of black plant. It's very gothy. It has red and white stripes and it turns kind of black, decaying. Really cool. It's a great thing to look for. And I think a mushroom hunter discovered the association at the coast in Oregon.
Yeah, I've got a photograph of it in my book. And it's the only plant I put in my whole book.
I guess I should look it up and just show everybody. That's like just always on hand. Michael's book, always on hand.
All right, what is the difference between endo and ectomycorrhizae?
Mycorrhizae, yeah. He's trying to say how, yeah.
It's the way the fungal mycelium penetrates the root of the tree versus gets on the surface of the root of the tree. So it's whether it's going inside and creating the structures inside the root or creating the structures outside the root.
That hyphal sheath, right, of the ecto, and then it doesn't penetrate inside of those roots. Yeah.
There's some other kinds of mycorrhizae too, but those are the two important ones for around here.
Do clear cuts destroy mycelium, and does replanting the trees make any difference?
Well, yeah, the clear cuts can destroy the mycelium. You'll find morels for a year after the clear cut, but you won't find much else for a long time. And it takes probably 50 or 60 years for a forest to recover from a clear cut, and then they cut it again. And forests that are older than 50 or 60 years are really contributing significantly to carbon dioxide uptake and utilization, to fertilization of the forest, to the health of the forest. And cutting trees at 50 to 60 years, which is our current practice, is very disastrous environmentally in all respects, from climate change to fungus.
And I guess another thing to consider here is like it's also the heavy equipment, right? It's heavy equipment, destroys soil, destroys, I mean, that's the place where the mycelium lives. So yeah.
All right, we got about 5 more minutes for questions. So whatever questions we don't get to during this question and answer session, we will try to send answers out to in a follow-up email. Your next question for you guys is, how can you tell if a mushroom is too old to be harvested or eaten?
Smell it. Smell it. Smell your mushrooms. And if you go like this, then don't eat it. It's really, mushrooms will let you know. In the same way that, like, you know, gosh, what's beans? Have you ever had old beans? Accidentally like forgot about those? That smell, there's a bad smell with mushrooms. I mean, decaying mushrooms will smell like decaying mushrooms. So anything to add, Michael?
Well, if you're a chemist like me, you've already destroyed your sense of smell, so it doesn't work very well. But how do you tell that your you shouldn't be using your celery anymore. It's starting to get slippery. It's starting to get big water spots in it. It's starting to get limpid. You know, if it doesn't look good to eat anymore, doesn't look fresh, like the chanterelles I looked at in the grocery store, I won't name it today, I wouldn't have eaten any of those chanterelles. They don't keep the rotten vegetables still out for sale. And it's the same sort of a visual clue that you look at for a carrot or a beet or a whatever.
Chicken, whatever it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there
You'll
rare
know.
are there rare and endangered fungi in the gorge we should be on the lookout for?
Well, there are species I've only seen once, found in one place and never seen again. I think that probably makes it rare and unusual, given that it's a mushroom habitat that I spend about every third day in during this fall season. And if it was there, if it wasn't rare, I'd find it. I've got mushrooms that I can see from my office where I'm sitting right now, where I'll look out and say, oh, I've never seen that before. And sure enough, 20 years go by and I haven't seen it again. It's not unusual. Now, that doesn't mean the plant isn't there. Some mushrooms, like chanterelles, are reliable every year. Other mushrooms, they can go 5, 10, 20 years before they produce fruit.
And I guess I'll also just add to that, Fundus, Fundis, is an organization for like mycoeducation around the world and preservation. And they have something called like the West Coast 10. So that's something to check out. There's 10, they kind of targeted through iNaturalist as well, and observations. They're looking for people to log these through their community science and our community science movement. So the Fundus West Coast 10, I think it's called, or anyways, there's 10 that you can look up if you're interested in that. But I want to also talk about what Michael said. There are so many mushrooms are unnamed. And even the names we have aren't necessarily right, or because we named them after European species that when we did DNA, they're different. So there's so much to discover. There's so much to see. And that's why it's a really right movement, and there's so much positive energy around it. There's so much there. So through logging your finds through iNaturalist, you can kind of help catalog all of these as climate change is happening and as logging and habitat is destroying these places. Anyway, something to think about.
So do you have a recommended app for IDing mushrooms, or are you using iNaturalist?
I like books, to be honest. Did I mention Michael's book a little bit? I like Michael's book. I like Mushrooms of the Redwood Coast. There's Mushrooms of British Columbia that came out recently that I really love, and Pacific Northwest mushrooms. Those are all excellent. These are wonderful. You should never eat a mushroom that is identified with AI. It can sometimes get you really reliably to like genus, but always do your due diligence and don't let an AI tell you that a masutake is, or an amanita is a masutake. Yeah, Michael, plug your book, Michael.
Well, that's why I wrote Mushrooms of Cascadia, and I'm working right now on the second edition. In fact, I will finish the page proofs probably, but there's going to be a bigger one, better, covering over 1,000 species, coming out next summer. Yeah, 10-speed press.
Sign me up.
You're holding, by the way, is now sold out. There's a couple stores that still have it. It's gone. But that's why I wrote the book. The apps, every once on my phone will tell me I've taken a picture and I hit something wrong, and it'll tell me what I photographed. And it is so far off, so consistently. But if I study a mushroom and identify it and then post it to iNaturalist, unless it's a pretty weird mushroom, iNaturalist always gets it right. But I posted an Amanita last week to iNaturalist, and it didn't have a clue what it was, because if it doesn't recognize it, it doesn't put a name on it. I've been studying the Cortinarius of the oaks of the Columbia River Gorge for 15 years now. And Noah Siegel, the author of Mushrooms of the Redwood Coast, and Shannon Adams are coming this weekend to hunt with me, because out of my first 600 collections of Cortinarius, which probably represented 100 species, we don't know yet for sure, only 2 had been named prior to my start. And at this point, we've only named 10. We've still got the vast majority unnamed. And so Noah and Shannon are coming to help me try and wrap up this study. But some of these things I've only seen once in 15 years. Some of these Cortinarius I find every year. But the vast majority aren't named. We don't, I know them, I recognize them.
So Michael is saying that through an AI, if it hasn't ever seen it before, it can't name it. Like, it definitely needs your eye. But I'll also say iNaturalist is it's the way that it works is you can use the AI feature, you can post it and log all the details, and then people can collaborate. So if you got that wrong, people like Noah Siegel, who wrote Redwoods of the Coast, is very active on that app. So they can actually correct your IDs, your identifications, and they can be research grade, or some people will ask you to send them mushrooms if they're doing a study. It's a great, so highly recommended iNaturalist for the AI feature, but just don't eat anything on it. But also people can collaborate with identifications.
But I want to emphasize, always double check iNaturalist, but don't trust any other AI app at all, not even 1 inch. They are so terrible. But I post things occasionally that I can't figure out on iNaturalist, and it'll recognize them. And if it does, then I can check and see if it got it right. And so far, of the 10 things that I didn't recognize that I've submitted in the last month, it's knew all of them. And
that's cool.
But I didn't trust it. I then went to a program called Mycology, which is free online, really more powerful than any of the books. And my book was written to support Mycology. It covers 4,000 species. My book comes second, and the new book will cover 100 species. But most mushroom books cover, like All That the Rain Promises and more, 50 species. So there's a lot to know.
Thank you both so much. Stay tuned for a follow-up email from us, and we will give information on where to get Michael's books and how to stay in touch with Krista after this webinar. Thank you all so much for watching and participating with us tonight. Those were some awesome questions and a great webinar getting to know more about fungi that can be found in the gorge. Before you go, I want to let you know that this webinar is a glimpse of many that we are going to host throughout the upcoming year. Your support means so much to us, and we hope to see you at our upcoming webinar in January. Keep an eye out for emails and social media posts to learn more. A reminder that a recording of this webinar will be uploaded to our YouTube page tomorrow. Next time you are out and about, take a look around and see that fungus truly is all among us. Thank you, have a great night, and a happy holiday season.
Thank you.
Thank you.